This is Monica Perez, and I am here with the fourth installment of the book that we are reading and commenting on and discussing called The Octopus Secret Government and the Death of Danny Casolaro. This is the fourth installment. We start with chapter 9. If you haven't heard this from the beginning, you got to start from the beginning. Go to the Monica Perez Show on your favorite podcasting platform. We uploaded part 1 on June 20th, 2024. So start there. And if you've been following along, I'm sure you're eager to hear this. So let's go. Chapter 9, Pursuit of the Tape. One of the incidents Danny Casolaro wrote about in his manuscript was the attempted retrieval of an important tape that Michael Riconosciuto, aka Danger Man, had stashed away. Here is Danny's account of this episode from his Octopus manuscript. Danny writes like a poet. So here we go. It is a pale moon that illuminates the characters in this story. With chords of fear and longing, it is a world of darkness and betrayal that everyone thinks they know, but few have seen. The real faces in this world are all too human. Danger Man's mind is as balkanized as the script he lives and the land he travels. Perhaps betrayal becomes a way of life. The background music no longer echoes national anthems, but T.S. Eliot's Gerontion. Think neither fear nor courage saves us. Unnatural vices are fathered by our heroism. Virtues are forced upon us by our impudent crimes. These impudent crimes are the subject of this update, and a brief capsule seems as hopeless as carving the Lord's Prayer on the head of a secret agent. For, like the enormous Danger Man himself, this story will resist shrinkage. Its events are too febrile, its local color too relentless. The sun had burned away the morning fog when I arrived in Seattle on Easter Sunday, bound for Everett, some 30 miles away. I had come to visit and retrieve a tape recording from the intriguing Danger Man himself, 43-year-old Michael J. Riconosciuto, whom lawmen had deposited in the Snohomish County Jail in Everett, Washington. The tape Danger Man has recorded a month earlier, he alleged, was a direct threat from a former Justice Department official describing 2 legal entanglements that were about to befall him if he cooperated with a mushrooming Capitol Hill inquiry. If this tape was retrievable, I knew this scandal was about to be publicly born. It was during the last year that I began calling Michael Danger Man. During hours of telephone calls from him, he had told me in exotic detail of his participation in an enterprise, quote, that worked its way around the world trading in dope, dirty money, weapons, biotoxins, and murder for the secrets of the temple. I had been unable to unearth some documentation, and a number of other people who were willing to provide. I had been able to unearth some documentation, and a number of other people who were willing to provide a rich array of detail regarding Danger Man, his former associates, and the underground empire he described. So he's corroborating some of this stuff, a lot of this stuff. But now he had become a key witness in the 8-year-old legal battle between the Justice Department and Inslaw, a District of Columbia computer company whose software tracking system called Promise has been used by law enforcement to track cases and criminals. But it will track anything once it's provided with the rules, Inslaw's founder says. Inslaw charged, and 2 courts have agreed, that the software selling for $150,000 per user had been stolen by a handful of people in the Justice Department in the course of a contract dispute. Now, Inslaw charges the software has been distributed by profiteers to intelligence and military agencies in, among other countries, Iraq, Libya, South Korea, Israel, and Canada. Inslaw's William Hamilton had independently learned from a Canadian official that Promise was being used in 900 different locations in Canada. A little more than a week before his arrest, Danger Man had filed an affidavit in the case on behalf of Inslaw, saying that private interests had hired him in the early 1980s to modify the software for Canadian distribution. Those private interests, he told me, represented tentacles of the underground cabal that made its home on an Indian reservation just north of Mexicali. In the affidavit, Danger Man said he was called in February by a former Justice Department official and warned against cooperating with an investigation into the case by the House Judiciary Committee. He added that the former justice official told him that if he talked to investigators, he would be implicated in an unrelated criminal case and would lose another ongoing child custody case. Late Friday evening on March 29th, on the Key Peninsula off Puget Sound, Danger Man was arrested for distribution of methamphetamine. I arrived in Snohomish County 2 days later on March 31st. This is ponderosa pine and giant fir country flanked by the Cascade Mountain Range to the east, Port Gardner Bay and the Olympic Mountains to the west, with the Snohomish River snaking through the north end of the city of Everett, the county seat. By late evening, I had been to the jail a number of times, and each time Danger Man was refused visitors on the orders of the U.S. Marshal in Seattle. Still, Danger Man was able to find me at a nearby motel and call several times from the jail with cryptic directions for the retrieval of the tape. His expected movement the following day to a federal magistrate in Tacoma, and more details about how dangerous he was becoming to the enterprise. That enterprise moved drugs, guns, and money to the ever-changing temples of power in different parts of the world, the geography changing with the political climate, unless the political climate could be changed to suit the enterprise, according to Danger Man, 2 other agents of influence, and a former Israeli agent. But no one is supposed to talk about it, and Danger Man told me again of his best friend Paul, who had been murdered in San Francisco almost 10 years earlier. Paul was the best there was as a money mover. The access codes he maneuvered were offshore accounts amounting to over $1 billion, Danger Man said. They don't play around. You're just found dead one day. Traveling to Tacoma with Danger Man's lawyer, I saw seals basking in the only shaft of sun I had seen so far in the Northwest, fat with their catch of steelhead trout moving to freshwater spawning. We talked of Danger Man's allegations, some documentable, and the tape that both of us had been promised. Michael sure called this one, the lawyer said. We arrived in Tacoma just before the 3 p.m. hearing. Danger Man filled the courtroom with his presence. Under 6 feet tall, he was immense in frame, but agile and graceful in movement like some giant white rabbit, or perhaps some hybrid fugitive creature related to a fox. A former Air America pilot who says he may know Danger Man under a name other than Michael Riconosciuto says he was called the Fat Man in Asia. Richard Bernecki won't even talk about Danger Man over the phone. Bernecki's claims through the years regarding his role in an October surprise plot to delay American hostages in Iran until after the 1980 election have been bouncing around for some time. The hearing before a federal magistrate in Tacoma concerned bail for Danger Man, which was refused. While the complaint charged an isolated incident of distributing drugs on March 29th, there were 4 other dates mentioned in which confidential informants with audio and video recordings were used as well. The next day, April 2nd, I was driving from Gig Harbor to a patch of bog in the peninsula on the reaches of Puget Sound. This is where, I was told, Danger Man had thrown a copy of the tape from a car on the night of his arrest. I was driven up into the hills on the peninsula. Here, the high pine trees, mostly wolf pine, and the red cedar stay in the rain shadow. The ground is mostly scrubland and skunk cabbage, heavy with the scent of wild herbs and flowers, especially in the pouring rain. Many of the people live in huts, some attached to mobile homes in the backwater of the peninsula. The first man I was to meet on this far end of nowhere was an old gray-bearded Swede in a wide-brimmed leather hat. He came out of his hut talking in staccato rhythms and reciting broken poetry. He appeared somewhere between 60 and 70 years of age. Can you cry? He asked me. Then prepare to shed a tear, and shed them now, he said. He hardly paused on the hillside in the pouring rain before advising that the fault is not in the stars. The fault is in ourselves. When he stopped talking, he started singing, and finally I was able to ask if he had a tape for me. My driver said, no, he doesn't have the tape. We just wanted you to meet some of Michael's old friends. Sitting side by side under a tarp, the bearded old Swede took me on a compulsory guided tour of Danger Man from the time he was a child winning science fairs to now. Prior to working with the Nobel laureate at Stanford's physics lab at 16 and 17 years of age, he had suddenly already distinguished himself in mining, sonar, lasers, and communications. Much of that I had heard before. Nobel laureate Dr. Arthur Shallow, in a lengthy interview months before, remembered Danger Man well. You don't forget a 16-year-old youngster who shows up with his own argon laser, Dr. Shallow had told me. There was an old article about Danger Man when he was 10 years old after he strung up an alternative telephone service in his neighborhood. The old Swede, Danger Man's father, and my driver wanted to make it very clear that this was a person who made very powerful people take notice of him when he was a boy. But why, I asked, would this group pursue him? Everyone, including Danger Man's father, would tell me to control him. He had been running from that, I was told, since the mid-'80s when he left the Indian reservation. I want to just have a little aside here. It starts to make you think, like, this guy was a child prodigy. He was tapped and exploited for what was obvious, extreme, and rare genius. And now, I mean, that's got to interfere with your development. And that might explain why he was such a picaresque character, if that's the right word. But also maybe why he's like a whistleblower and really uncontrollable. But it reminded me of two other things that's making me really believe, I think they tap people young for several reasons. One is the created person thing, where they can use them for a variety of purposes. But this other thing is when they find something special in you. And this thing of them noticing his genius at an early age, of two other people, Julian Assange, his first kind of noteworthy event in Wikipedia is that he was caught hacking at a young age, by the authorities, and let off the hook. Read his wiki stuff. You'll see, he was caught. So my thought was, okay, he was tapped as early as that because of his special genius. And I just read yesterday in Jeremy Kuzmarov's article on Covert Action magazine about Peter Thiel. And in it, he points out that Sean Parker, who was the first president of Facebook, was identified by the FBI or brought in by the FBI, something like that, when he was 16 or 17 years old, again, because he was a prodigious hacker. And as a child, a young person. And I think Thiel brought him in as the president of Facebook, but the CIA tapped him earlier. So this, it's just something to think about, that this does actually happen. And that is definitely, I think it's undisputed that was Michael Riconosciuto was one of those guys. So he had been running from that, I was told, since the mid-'80s when he left the Indian reservation. And now he was regarded as a rogue, always presenting a moving target, having been harassed through the years by brigades of law enforcement for one charge or another. I had even found an old letter of his dating back to 1982 in which he described having to present a periscopic image to the public. One more aside. I actually think that when they give you all these standardized tests and if you do well on them, they elevate you. So I dropped out of high school, but I did well on standardized tests. I went to community college and I transferred to Harvard. And I always wondered, why? They don't need, I was not very well educated, and I was only 2 years at Harvard. They couldn't have educated me very well, even if they wanted to. And I figured because they think you're either out or you're in. So if you do well, they want to make sure you're in. And I mean, not everybody, thousands, millions of people go to these schools, and very few of them end up as prodigies or in the system or whatever. But I'm just saying, I think that those tests, that's what I was thinking about JD Vance, his whole trajectory changed when he was in the Marines and he was tapped for the media relations department. And I can't help but think that they give you a bunch of tests when you go in there, intelligence tests, but also psych tests, and they see if you're suited to that. And then after that, he went to Ohio State, and then he went to Yale Law School, which is an absolute moonshot. So I just feel like they're saying they wanted to control Riconosciuto. Yeah, I think that's probably right. And this idea of always chasing him around with like charges, threatening charges against him, is a way to control him. The rain did not let up as the old Swede danced in the brush. I watched a big jackrabbit dart under and then away from the old Swede's tarp before it limped trembling and hidden in the grass. I mean, this guy, so I guess he was trying to write a really, artistic book. While some creatures are born to hunt, others are born to flee. These are nature's fugitives, and like the fox, have a curious freedom in the masks they wear and access to obscure regions where no one will follow. Sometimes they have the protective coloring of the hunter, but that is the ruse of the fox. They learn that instinctively. By the end of the week, I had trucked back and forth across Puget Sound by daylight and nightfall in an odyssey of pursuit for the tape. I would meet Danger Man in jail and talk with him many times from the Kitsap County jail to which he had been moved on the peninsula. I had also been placated, I presumed, with documents concerned mostly with weapons, fuel air explosives, documents relating to Gerald Bull, assassinated the previous spring in Brussels, Carlos Cardoan in Chile, mining papers, lab papers relating to scientific experiments with lasers, and letters regarding the return of that mysterious $1 billion which Danger Man had said come from the Nugan Bank in Australia. I'd already seen some of these documents in the months before, but now it looks as though the gumshoes from the House Judiciary Committee would also see them. 2 Capitol Hill investigators had arrived on my heels to interview Danger Man. By the end of the week, they had arrived in Seattle, had discussions with the U.S. attorney, and made arrangements to have Danger Man moved. I'm screwed, Danger Man said. Don't you see? These guys are my only hope. I've come up with the cheapest way to refine platinum there is. This guy is really a multifaceted genius. But I'm screwed because they'll try to show that the chemicals I use at the mine are precursor ingredients to making methamphetamine. The chemicals at one of his labs included, he said, chloracetone, sodium cyanide, nitric acid, ammonium chloride, and bags of platinum dust. If I received the tape, the original, I was to give it to the investigators, he said. I could make a copy, he added, to bring back to Washington, D.C. The next morning, Danger Man was moved from his cell on the Kitsap Peninsula to Seattle, where the Judiciary Committee investigators and their stenographer would be interviewing him. I arrived in Seattle and met both investigators. Despite their refusal to let me accompany them on their interview with Danger Man, we reached an agreement to engage in dialogue back in the nation's capital. They spent all day with Danger Man and then, I learned, provided documents from another repository which I had not seen in Bremerton at the southern tip of the inlet. Having arrived on the 3rd of April, both investigators left on the 5th. By the tail end of the week, I had learned that federal agents had raided one of Danger Man's labs in the mountainous Pine Creek area west of Tonasket, still high in rain and snowmelt, as well as his place in Aberdeen, a coastal strip town, and still another place in Anaheim, California. I had previously talked to a Denver businessman about Danger Man and his elusiveness. I watched Mike demonstrate a new laser weapon he had created, the Denver man said. A wand that blew whatever he pointed it at straight up in the air. I had called a number of high-ranking military people, and Michael was scheduled to demonstrate this new creation at Fort Hood, Texas. When the time came and we gathered at Fort Hood, Michael just didn't show. That's the way he was then, and I don't expect he's any different now. I wonder if they hesitated to kill him because he was such a unique genius. It doesn't sound like he kept working for them, but maybe he did. Like he was quirky. Maybe he worked for them inside jail. Who knows? The beginning of spring always has its moody, bad-tempered transitions. But with the tape never emerging, I was more than a little frustrated and more than doubtful in the tape's existence. I hope for your sake I'm wrong, I told him when he was back in the jail at Kitsap County. He was unhappy I was leaving. I could sense his feelings grow mute in embarrassment. Everything in him withdrew. A silence arose. I was going to be indulgent with whatever he said, which I knew would still leave both of us empty-handed. For ultimately and precisely in the deepest and most important matters, especially if he was telling the truth, he was unspeakably alone. I returned home the next day. All right, so here's a end of chapter. Here is, before the next chapter starts, a big fat quote. It doesn't say who's saying it. I imagine it's foreshadowing to what's to come. Arriving just a few minutes before his flight, Abby called me and started talking in a stream as soon as I picked up the phone. This fucking truck swerved, fucking truck. I didn't get a chance to ask him what truck. Then, just as suddenly as he'd began, his tone changed, grew quieter and conspiratorial. Jack, don't believe anything you might hear on the radio or see in the newspapers tonight. Whatever it is, it's not true. Chapter 10, Mysterious Deaths. Riconosciuto could claim a dark credibility derived from the fact that colleagues in his shadowy world continued to fall. An attorney from Philadelphia, Dennis Eisman, known as the, quote, fatal vision lawyer because of his involvement in the Jeffrey McDonald case, was in touch with Casolaro and was scheduled to travel to Washington to defend Riconosciuto, planning also to meet with a woman who had evidence of threat to his client. In April, Eisman was shot and killed in his car in Philadelphia. According to one source, just prior to Eisman's death, indictments were pending against him and other attorneys for narcotics trafficking and money laundering. The indictments never appeared. As soon as Michael Riconosciuto found out that Eisman was dead, he called Virginia McCullough. McCullough said that he was absolutely panicky in jail. Riconosciuto told her, "They've killed my attorney," and asked her to telephone another attorney working on his case, James Guthrie, to warn him. McCullough did, and Guthrie told McCullough, "I'm out of here." 9 days after Michael Riconosciuto issued his affidavit in the Inslaw case, he was arrested. In April 1991, police arrested Riconosciuto on one count of distributing methamphetamine manufacture at Lake Bay in Washington state. Investigators for the Intelligence Committee of the House of Representatives met with Riconosciuto in Tacoma, spent 6 hours taking depositions from him, and asked him for proof for his statements by way of legal documents. According to one report, Riconosciuto asked for clear, quote, lawyer-client privilege labeling on documents when he called them in from his attorney as a precaution against search and seizure by government agencies. Nevertheless, Riconosciuto's jailers opened the privileged packages and refused to forward them. Instead, the report goes on, they contacted the NSA, which sent a team to review the material. By the end of December 1991, the agency had not commented on when the documents would be returned to Riconosciuto. That's another thing that happens. As an aside, you're not allowed, and you know, William from History Homos brings this up, that we're often not allowed to bring evidence in our own defense. The two people I think of right away are Ross Ulbricht, whose investigators in his case were jailed for malfeasance in his case, and he wasn't allowed to bring that up at trial. And I think it's Joe Nacchio, Nacchio, the former head of Quest Communications, who he believed he was framed for insider trading after he refused to allow the Bush administration to institute warrantless wiretaps. And he had evidence to support that, or at least it was a good theory, and he was not permitted to bring that up in his own defense, and he went to jail for years. I mean, those are just two stories I know off the top of my head, and looks like they kept this guy's documentation, which he wanted to have in his pocket for defense, and he doesn't have it now. Okay, continuing. Casolaro conferred with Riconosciuto regularly in late 1989 and flew to Tacoma for the trial and to act as a legal investigator for 10 days. Their meeting and the fruitless search for the alleged tape recording of Videnics may have contributed to a certain disillusionment that Danny felt about Danger Man by the time he returned home. "That guy is nuts," he told a journalist after his Washington trip. No such assessment of a Riconosciuto's sanity was needed to determine that his statements were suspect. In addition to life among the euphonauts, Riconosciuto failed to produce an oft-requested passport to corroborate his claimed trips to Iran. When asked by the CNN Moneyline program to describe Peter Vedanix, whom he claimed to have met on several occasions and who threatened him on the lost tape, Riconosciuto was unable to do so. That is interesting. Whereas you recall, Casolaro corroborated a lot of what Riconosciuto said with documents and with 3 other witnesses. In one of our previous episodes, we heard the affidavits of those people, including Riconosciuto, concerning these events. 4 days after interviewing Danger Man on June 19th, 1991, former Nixon campaign aide Alan Michael May died in his home in San Francisco. During the interview, Riconosciuto had talked about May's involvement in the October surprise. The initial coroner's report attributed May's death to heart attack, but an autopsy showed the presence of polypharmaceuticals in his body. Anson Ing, a reporter for the Financial Times of London, pursued Jimmy Hughes, the Wackenhut security guard, I know who this guy is, central to the Alvarez murder case, to South Africa in an attempt to get an interview. One more aside. South Africa, man, that place, you know what's like I think I met one person from South Africa my entire life, but I read about them all the time. First of all, Elon Musk, Peter Thiel spent some of his youth in South Africa with his parents. Like a large portion of Ole Dammegard's book, Coup d'etat in slow motion, I think it's called, about the assassination of Olaf Palme. Lots of stuff about South Africa. I mean, stuff, that place. Hunter Biden's wife / handlers from South Africa. I mean, I feel like that's just like a deep state outpost. While in Guatemala during July 1991, Ng was murdered by a single bullet to the chest. His death was ruled a suicide. The Guatemalan government was asked to retrieve Ng's floppy disks and personal papers regarding his investigation. This is crazy. It did so and turned them over to U.S. intelligence. In a press conference a few weeks later, Senator Alan Cranston requested that these items be returned, but they never were. I mean, I'm like dumbstruck here. I'm reading that paragraph again. I'm sorry. Anson Ing, a reporter for the Financial Times of London, pursued Jimmy Hughes, the Wackenhut security guard central to the Alvarez murder case. I mean, some people said he did it. To South America. Okay. Still, all that's true about South Africa. I'm not kidding. But okay, that makes sense now. South America in an attempt to get an interview. While in Guatemala during July 1991, Ng was murdered by a single bullet to the chest. Wow. His death was ruled a suicide, of course. Guatemalan government was asked to retrieve his floppy disk and personal papers. It did so, turned them over to intelligence, and the Senator Alan Cranston requested their return, but they were never returned. Okay. More than a year earlier, on March 31st, 1990, a British journalist named Jonathan Moyle was found dead, hung in a hotel room closet in Santiago, Chile. Although Casolaro and Moyle were probing different leads, their investigations involved some of the same people, said columnist Jack Anderson. Moyle, an editor at London's Defense Helicopter World, I guess that was a magazine, had been investigating the weapons trade, specifically the alleged sale of non-military U.S. helicopters to Iraq for refitting as attack choppers. The notes, that's in the 90s, that selling attack. I know that we instituted that Iraq-Iran war, but I mean, it wasn't too long after that when we turned the tables on Iraq. The notes Moyle left behind contained reference to a sophisticated missile guidance system that held Iraqi interest, although whether or not it used the system in its disastrous Scud attacks during the Persian Gulf War is unknown. Instrumental in the arms dealing Moyle had investigated was Carlos Cardoen, the same man Ari Ben-Menashe identified as the intermediary between Iraq and Earl Bryan for the promised software deal. Initial reports called Moyle's death a suicide, of course, but evidence, including the presence of a strong sedative in his system and possible asphyxiation, suggested otherwise. It is unclear whether or not Moyle kept contact with Danny Casolaro, although his notes include references to Carlos Cardoen and the Iraqi missile deal. Casolaro knew about Alan May and had also learned about Anson Ng's death shortly after it took place. He also remembered the January murder of Alan Standorf. Riconosciuto had introduced Casolaro to Standorf as an electronic intelligence operative of the NSA working at the Vint Hill military installation in Virginia that gathered information from espionage satellites and other sources throughout the world. Casolaro agreed that Standorf had important information linking the Justice Department to parts of the various scandals he had researched. After Standorf's death, Danny mentioned to a friend, Bill Turner, that a key source had vanished. Did Danny feel the tentacles tightening? If so, it was not reflected in his research notes. He collected information on vicious killers and power brokers, but gave no clue that he thought they were coming after him. Over time, Michael Riconosciuto lost 3 lawyers and an investigator under what could be construed as mysterious circumstances. In February 1987, Larry Guerin, a private investigator conducting InSlaw-connected work for Riconosciuto, was killed in Mason County, Washington. After Eisman's death in April 1993, another attorney who worked with Riconosciuto, John Crawford, died suddenly from a heart attack in Tacoma. The decomposed body of a third Riconosciuto lawyer, Paul Wiltshire, was found in Wiltshire's Washington, D.C. apartment on June 23, 1993. Wiltshire also had been an attorney for the pilot Gunther Rossbacher, who claimed to have videotaped proof of 16 witnesses to his having flown George H.W. Bush to one of the October surprise meetings. Wow. Wiltshire belonged to the American Patriot Fax Network and had recently prepared an ambitious 55-page fax summarizing information on circumstances leading to the fiery deaths of David Koresh and his followers in April 1993 that he sent as a challenge to Attorney General Janet Reno. The fax included details of the story of his client Rossbacher concerning the October surprise and a page of information on the InSlaw case, pointing out that an executive assistant to Senator Robert Byrd, Democrat from West Virginia, was the wife of Peter Videnix, who had threatened Riconosciuto. The mysterious death list came also to include the execution-styled slaying of Ian Spiro and his family, a wife and 3 daughters in San Diego on November 1st, 1992. This is absolutely chilling. Spiro reportedly worked for U.S. and British intelligence agencies on operations that included the October surprise, Iran-Contra, and the hostage crisis in Lebanon. Spiro spoke with Riconosciuto, for whom he was helping collect documents to present to a grand jury only a few days before his death. Later, others would begin to develop lists of significant deaths related to the InSlaw case in much the same way many began making connections between the deaths of witnesses and others associated to the JFK assassination 25 years earlier. In addition to the Riconosciuto lawyers, the list included Valley Delahanty, whose knowledge of a DEA plan to set up Riconosciuto on a drug charge would have made her an important witness for Riconosciuto. She disappeared on August 18, 1992, but her body was not discovered until the following April in a ravine near Lake Bay, Washington. Another Riconosciuto ally, Pete Sandvigen, who was working to help Riconosciuto defend himself from the drug charges, died the following December, an ammo clip from the gun he carried mysteriously missing. Could this possibly go on? I mean, isn't that enough? Barry Kuznick, a computer engineer who had worked on PROMIS enhancements, also made the list. According to one report, Kuznick's enhancement was called Brainstorm, an artificially intelligent program that applied the prognosticating ability of PROMIS to individual thought patterns. Okay, so you might recall PROMIS could look at, one of the examples they used was they have all these terrorists or all these perps or whatever, all these people in the database, constantly collating their information. And if in one, sector of this, somebody's electricity bills go up, at the same time, they're going to say that guy has a house guest. And then they'll look and see if anybody else's electricity bills went down. And then they'll know that that guy was staying at this guy's house. Now, your telephone, your phone, your iPhone is doing that all the time. The location services definitely can alert like changes or patterns. My example is always if they show you at somebody's house that's not your own house at lunchtime during the week, you're probably having an affair. You know, that's going to flag it. That's going to flag. So what they're saying is somehow that ability, I assume that's what they mean, could be applied to individual thought patterns. It ostensibly allowed Promise to deduce from personality characteristics the potential action of the person being traced. As in the Inslaw case, Kusnik apparently had made the modifications under a government contract that the government failed to pay, attempting to drive Kusnik into bankruptcy. Yes, that's the thing. They're not paying because they can't afford it. They want to drive the guy into bankruptcy and then own his work product so they can make billions off it. That was the big upshot here, that as much as you want to believe in lizards and aliens and stuff, right on, Satan, like, definitely there's evil running the world, but so much of this is about this very, very large corruption, in my opinion. Real big, big money that would boggle the mind, seems to me. Kusnik had previously done communications and intelligence work for Northrop Corporation and the U.S. military. His body had not been found, and 9 months after he was reported missing, family members were unable to get known business partners to acknowledge knowing him. 5 boxes of his belongings were found in a lockup facility. Sherman Skolnick, a longtime chairman of Chicago's Citizens Committee to Clean Up the Courts, charged that nearly 40 witnesses in the Inslaw case had been murdered. Whoa! And complained that a federal judge appointed to review the case failed to show concern over the safety of other witnesses. Wow. He also claimed that a special federal grand jury in Chicago planned to do an end run around the judge and issue high-level indictments. Skolnick also reported that 3 of the grand jury witnesses joined with Riconosciuto to file suit against the judge for obstructing the indictments, and that the judge had an FBI agent interrogating witnesses who was himself suspected of murdering Casolaro. An FBI agent who was, I guess, later suspected of killing Casolaro. Crazy. Most interesting of all, the mysterious deaths connected to Inslaw, however, was that of 1960s political activist Abby Hoffman. Oh, I guess that's what that quote was about. Hoffman wrote an early piece on the October surprise for Playboy magazine and shortly thereafter was involved in a suspicious automobile accident. Most regarded his death on April 12th, 1989 as the suicide it was reported as, caused perhaps in part due to depression he suffered from the continued pain resulting from that accident. Others, however, suspected foul play in Hoffman's death, notably David Dellinger, a fellow member of the Chicago Eight. Dellinger's suspicions even led him to attempt to retrieve the coroner's report for examination, but he was stopped by a threatened court battle. They basically would not allow that to go to court, Dellinger concluded, but Abby's son Andrew and Abby's first wife Sheila are convinced he was killed. Wow. All right, that was chapter 10. That was really chilling. Chapter 11, Robert Booth Nichols. The Hamiltons acquired another important informant and introduced him to Danny Casolaro. Robert Booth Nichols, not to be confused with John Philip Nichols. Casolaro wrote in his notes that Robert Nichols looks like Clark Gable. Nichols presented himself as a dashing spy-like figure with connections to both the legal and illegal underworld, including the infamous Gambino crime family. He had worked at the Cabazon Reservation with Riconosciuto. Riconosciuto and Nichols formed a business partnership in the 70s to manufacture fertilizer, pesticide, and weaponry, including fuel-air explosives and the G-77, an inexpensive submachine gun invented by Nichols. But the two had argued in 1984 and had not spoken since. Casolaro and Nichols spoke on the phone 15 times in July, calls which lasted as long as 2 hours. They met at the Four Seasons Hotel in Washington, D.C. on July 10, 1991. Casolaro was so impressed with the sophistication and insider knowledge his new friend Nichols had that he came to consider him a mentor. At one point, Casolaro spoke to him about his money troubles, and Nichols offered financial assistance in exchange for a 25% interest in Casolaro's home and right of first refusal if he sold it. To tempt his girlfriend, Wendy Weaver, into accompanying him to his meeting with Nichols at the Four Seasons, Casolaro described Nichols as the president of the Bechtel Corporation, just arrived from Kuwait. Nichols intimated at the dinner party that he was going to be named state security minister of the Caribbean island of Dominica, which would become a center for rebuilding Kuwait. Nichols repeatedly warned Casolaro that what he was researching was dangerous. Nichols warned Casolaro at least 5 times about the danger of associating with Riconosciuto. He warned that if Casolaro said anything that went against Nichols' former partner, Riconosciuto, he would be killed. At one point during the evening, responding to a slight from another patron at the bar that Weaver later described as imagined, Nichols grabbed the man, slammed him against the wall, and declared that he would kill him. Later that evening, Casolaro confided to Weaver that Nichols really scared him. In his notes, Danny Casolaro characterized Nichols as very powerful. And these pictures are basically impossible to really see. They're very grainy, even in the book. But I'm showing a picture of Robert Booth Nichols, who supposedly looked like Clark Gable, and Clyde's in Tyson Corner, which was the meeting place of Danny Casolaro and Robert Nichols. On another night, Casolaro and a different friend met Nichols at Clyde's in Tyson's Corner. Nichols again talked about Dominica, saying he had just done a radio broadcast in his new position as Minister of State Security, and he also said that he was part of a planned CIA coup that was going to happen there. Casolaro's friend claimed that Nichols had this story that they were going to turn Dominica into a CIA base, had plans for a desalinization program, and pulled out this design drawn by a French architect of a dome the size of Texas Stadium that was half underwater. Really, the whole thing reminded me of Ernst Stavro Blofeld. Is that a Bond villain, if I recall correctly? After lunch, Danny took his friend aside and showed him what he alleged was a summary of an FBI wiretap on Nichols that linked him to the Yakuza and the Gambino family. The friend was shocked. I said, Danny, I'm going to take you out back and whip your ass. You just put me in a meeting with this man and didn't tell me? What the hell? Why didn't you tell me before? Casolaro explained he just wanted to see how Nichols would react. Casolaro related Nichols' stories about Dominica in his notes. Before the reins of the Octopus are turned over to several younger players, the game continues now, July 1991, on the tiny Caribbean island nation of Dominica. Possessing the largest boiling deep water lake in the world, Dominica's geothermal potential is unmatched. It is here that the Octopus may be making its boldest and most dangerous move yet. I'd be curious on what's going on in Dominica right now. I mean, not that we'd know. In 1976, Nichols represented a Saudi company, Ali and Fad, in a failed attempt to acquire Howard Hughes' Summa Corporation after the death of the reclusive magnate. Joseph Cicipio, Ciccipio. I usually try to look up the names, but I'm past the point where I had read before. So I'm going with Cicipio. Later taken as a hostage in Lebanon, was an employee of Ali and Fad at the time and stated that Nichols represented himself as an agent for the U.S. government in the takeover bid. Cicipio said that Nichols showed him Justice Department identification and had information which he assumed could only have been acquired through government contacts. Casolaro learned more about Nichols from Richard Stavin, formerly a special prosecutor for the Justice Department's organized crime strike force, who had some familiarity with Nichols' attachment to the mob end of the entertainment industry. On July 31st, 1991, Stavin explained to Danny about Nichols' connections to the Gambinos and the Yakuza, which the FBI had investigated in 1987 as part of its probe of mafia presence in Hollywood. Stavin also mentioned that Nichols had at one time offered to become an informant for the Justice Department, although he did not know whether anyone had taken him up on the offer. Stavin felt that passing this information on may have contributed to Danny's death. The FBI's focus in 1987 was on mob influence in the motion picture industry. They took particular interest in Eugene Giacinto, a member of the board of directors of Nichols Meridian Arms, a firm that was to manufacture the G77 gun in South Korea. At that time, Giacinto also served as president of the home entertainment sector of MCA, which owned Universal Pictures. I mean, these people, like, they have legit jobs, and then it's like mafia or CIA. It's like mind-blowing. That's what I'm saying. Like, the more I read this stuff and like the Biden stuff, the corruption that they've been involved in, there's like numerous things like this when you fall down that rabbit hole. Like, the corruption is crazy. In his application to wiretap Giacinto, agent Thomas G. Gates, who later supplied information to Casolaro, suggested that FBI investigative files indicated that in 1978, Nichols had been an international money launderer for money generated through narcotics trafficking and organized crime activities. The wiretaps caught Giacinto and Nichols discussing a takeover of MCA and revealed Giacinto's connection to renowned mobster John Gotti. Although the investigation was derailed by members of the Reagan administration, Giacinto left both MCA and Meridian, but not before unsuccessfully trying to secure an appointment for Nichols to head an industry anti-video piracy operation in Asia. Nichols denied any involvement with the Yakuza or the Mafia. Ron Rosenbaum wrote in Vanity Fair that Nichols traced the trouble to an FBI misunderstanding of his screenplay career. He says he was introduced to a high-level executive of MCA several years ago at a coffee shop. When the MCA man encouraged him to turn some tales, he told him, into screenplays, they became friends and briefly business associates. Unknown to him, the MCA man was the subject of a full-court press FBI investigation for being a key organized crime link to the entertainment industry. And so Gable, that is Nichols, says his voice was picked up by taps on the MCA man's phone. The Bureau misinterpreted their conversations as containing code words for illegal activities, turned around, targeted him, and slandered him to his business associates. In fact, Gable's company is suing an FBI man for libel and slander. He says that the wiretap summary was part of the FBI man's affidavit in the Gable slander suit. Okay, well, I'm going to show you the pictures I'm looking at right now. They don't really make a lot of sense to me. They are Steven Seagal sporting somebody else's military issue beret and insignia, and Steven Seagal with ex-CIA operative Robert Strickland. So let's see what this is all about. Nichols' response to Gates' affidavit linking him to John Gotti and the Gambino family through Giacinto was to sue Gates and the U.S. government for libel. However, the federal district courts dismissed Nichols' suits twice. Gates, believing Nichols to be undeterred in his attempt at retribution, said in testimony before the House Judiciary Committee that informants had twice told him that Nichols had placed a contract on his life. The other high point of Nichols' movie career came with his cameo appearance as a terrorist in the 1992 Steven Seagal movie Under Siege. Perhaps not coincidentally, Seagal became embroiled in controversy when a writer, Alan Richman, claimed in GQ magazine that Seagal had appropriated details of the biographies of former associates Robert Strickland and Gary Goldman and passed them off as incidents in his own life. When investigator John Connolly later repeated the charges in Spy and made further claims that Seagal tried to set up Richmond in a fake homosexual tryst and tried to have Goldman killed, Seagal sued unsuccessfully. I think there were other scandals about Seagal. Maybe domestic abuse. I don't know. Maybe something. Maybe he has like a history. Not, bad guy in more than one way. I don't know. I might Google that a little bit. In 1993, Nichols sought damages against the Los Angeles Police Department over an incident that caused the revocation of his concealed weapons permit and consequently a cancellation of the money for the manufacture of the G77 by Swiss financiers. According to his testimony, Nichols had been thrown to the floor, disarmed, handcuffed, and carted off to a North Hollywood jail by LAPD officers responding to a disturbance complaint at a club called the Palomino. Nichols said he was not involved with any disturbance, but had only stopped in at the club for a couple of beers. Further testimony and legal documents reflected an impressive list of former business partners, including Howard Hughes' cohort, Robert Mayhew, and Texas oil magnate Clint Murchison. I'm going to pause for a second to ask anyone who's like in the chat, can you see, I don't want to say, they're like all this talk about libel and stuff. I don't want to say something that isn't true. Does Seagal have any kind of scandal behind him? Because I would rather retract it than have it hanging out there in the same episode. You know what I mean? Otherwise, I'll pause at the end and look it up. Casolaro may not have understood the possible danger of possessing the information he had learned from Richard Staven that Nichols may have offered himself as a government stool pigeon. Casolaro may have worried that if he let slip his knowledge of Nichols' association with the mafia and the Yakuza during a conversation, Nichols might turn dangerous. 6 days after talking to Staven, Casolaro spoke again to his mentor. The following day, Casolaro informed Staven that Nichols had warned him off the investigation. At about the same time, Casolaro called FBI agent Thomas Gates and asked whether he should take seriously Nichols' warnings that if you continue this investigation, you will die. Gates later commented that Casolaro was upbeat, not like a person contemplating suicide. Sorry, I'm just trying to figure out. There's a footnote here. I don't normally read the footnotes, but I'm going to read a footnote to this. In January 1993, writer John Connolly cast suspicion on the relationship between Bill Hamilton and Robert Booth Nichols. Quote, despite Hamilton's reservations about Nichols' character, the man who designed a program for tracking criminals and the man who has been linked by the FBI to two crime organizations communicate with surprising frequency. Last summer, I visited Hamilton's office in Washington to get a copy of the phone records that would show his call to Nichols on August 9th, 1991. He seemed reluctant. It took a fair amount of persuasion to convince him to turn it over, and what he gave me was a photocopy with all but that call blocked out. Shortly after leaving, I remembered that I wanted to ask him something else and returned to his office. While I was waiting in the reception area, the phone rang. The receptionist buzzed Hamilton. Robert Booth Nichols, returning your call. When I asked Hamilton about the call, he replied, I call Nichols all the time. It was just a coincidence that it was right after you left. This was from John Connolly, dead right, in the magazine Spy, January 1993. That's interesting because you don't hear like too much sketchy stuff about Hamilton, but it sounds like Nichols had information for these guys like that. It's very weird. Okay, I have I would not normally go over, but this next chapter is not even one whole full page. So I'm going to finish that. I'm going to look up the Seagal thing and I'm going to call it a day. Chapter 12. A sea creature surfaces. A sea creature surfaces. On May 8th, 1991, the Inslaw case was overturned on second appeal on the technicality that it should not have been tried in bankruptcy court. The ruling came on the day before the Justice Department would have had to release all of its software to the Hamiltons. The Hamiltons asked the Supreme Court to hear the case in October. In mid-June 1991, so like a little while later, month later, Danny Casolaro met with Jeff Steinberg, the Lyndon LaRouche aide. Steinberg, who had earlier arranged the contact between the Hamiltons and Michael Riconosciuto, arranged for Casolaro to talk to an informant who went by the odd name of Chips, a former customs agent who was now assisting the Treasury Department. Steinberg believes that Chips turned Casolaro's investigations further in the direction of Robert Booth Nichols toward the Gambino mafia family and drug trafficking. Shortly thereafter, Casolaro made phone contact with E. Howard Hunt, a name that appears on the A-list of many conspiracy researchers. Yeah, Of late, Hunt had made a career writing spy fiction, but his infamy stretched back to his role as one of the Watergate burglars and before. Hunt had lost a defamation case against accusations that he had been involved in the JFK assassination. He lost the defamation case. Hunt had been active in many spook projects of the Kennedy era, most notably in the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. Even as Casolaro developed a cordial, even effusive relationship with Hunt, he kept taking notes. In a memo, Steinberg observed that by this time, Casolaro was on the trail of Inslaw and related stories, quote, back to a dirty CIA old boy network, end quote, that had begun working together in the 50s around covert operations in Albania. These men had gotten into the illegal gun and drug trade back then and had continued in that business ever since. Martin Killian, a Washington correspondent for Der Spiegel, also spoke to Casolaro about the conspiratorial entity Casolaro was by now calling the Octopus, a cabal which Casolaro believed had been started by CIA super spook James Jesus Angleton. Casolaro believed that the motive for creating the Octopus had been revenge for the notorious Albanian operation, which had been compromised by Soviet mole Kim Philby. A note on James Jesus Angleton. The reason I say Jesus and most people say Jesus is that when I read about him, his mother was Latin and she wanted to impart to him some of the Latin heritage by giving him that name. So I assume it's meant to be pronounced in the Latin way. So correct me if I'm wrong. And you know that it's not the way he pronounced it. According to Tony Casolaro, Danny's brother, Danny did not see the Octopus as a tightly structured organization. And I will just, as another aside, also does not seem like it was called the Octopus because there were only 8 people involved. That idea has been floated, but I don't believe that. Quote, this is a quote from his brother. He didn't envision them as a group like the mafia, more as a network. They would overlap when their needs coincided. The view reflected in Casolaro's notes was that, quote, this is the Octopus whose defensive posture could wreak havoc anywhere in the world. Indeed, what you will learn in this true crime narrative is a massive unraveling of modern history's most incredible puzzles. Wow. All right. So the next chapter, chapter 13, is called The Octopus. We'll pick that up in part 5. So thank you, Abundance Protocol, for sending me a massive wave of love, power, awareness, positive abundance, love, joy, energy. Thank you. Onward, forward. I sure love positive energy. So please, yes, send it my way. And Victory, Jin, nice. Concurs. Thank you. So you don't have to wait, but I'm going to take like 1 second, maybe 15 seconds to look up if Steven Seagal had a some kind of yeah, okay. So he's been accused by many women of sexual misconduct, but I think also outside the statute of limitations, I don't usually give unfounded past the statute of limitation allegations, but I think maybe his partner or wife kind of validated it. I don't know, but I just recall having heard quite a few things about him, but I was surprised that I, maybe the first time I read the book, but like this kind of stuff I have not seen. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. And if you want to catch up on any of the previous episodes, the first one was June 20th. So you can go to my feed, The Monica Perez Show, on your favorite podcasting platform, or they're still up on YouTube. I'm kind of waiting to get a strike. I'm taking down all the stuff about like, the assassination attempt and everything, but I'm leaving this up. I'm hoping it's too old to get anyone to be mad at me for it. But you can always find my stuff on Rockfin and Rumble if you are looking for it and you can't find it here. Hey, thanks very much, everybody. Until next time, I'm going to try to maybe do book chapters once a week, once every other week. Hopefully that will work, not keep you hanging on the edge of your seat for too long. Okay. Thanks so much.